wrong view there. Alright, so good evening, folks. I am super excited to do this deck for you guys tonight. This one is what I call the Sliver Immortal. Sliver decks are pretty well known in Magic, and they can be quite a nuisance. In particular, having a deck that is based around Sliver Overlord is quite menacing. Sliver Overlord is one of the best commanders, I think, in the game, on top of the fact that Slivers as an archetype is very, very versatile. It can protect itself, it's very aggressive, it can do anything you want it to do depending on how you want to build your deck. So, a little bit of history. I've been building this deck really for a long time. This deck has gone through several iterations, and to a degree, it's still going through several iterations because there are certain cards I'm still trying to collect. For example, every Sliver in this deck, with the exception of Sliver Queen, is foil. I have 2 out of the 10 OG dual lands in here. I have some Masterpiece artifacts in here, and I have all 10 of the fetch, like the real good fetch lands in here. So I've really made it a point to make this deck as optimized as possible, and that's why I even call this an optimized build, even though you'll see some things in here are kind of unconventional to my build style, but it's because they have some cards in here have a lot of overlap, so that way I can house more slivers that give me more either protection or give me an ability that I really want out of them. This deck is a combo deck after all, and Sliver Overlord is one of those that's really good at searching for our slivers. It literally is a tutor on a stick for a commander, which is why most people want to kill this commander on sight if they see it. So you have to make sure that you protect your commander as best you can. Now, an interesting part about this deck too is that it uses something called the companion mechanic. The companion mechanic came out in Ikoria, and it utilizes creatures that actually start outside of your starting deck for the game. It is the only cards that are allowed in Commander to actually start outside of your Commander deck. So this deck, on top of the fact that it is based completely on a Sliver Tribal, and it is optimized and, again, unconventional for my normal build style, it's actually 101 cards as opposed to the only 100 cards you're typically allowed. Also, if you didn't know, it is Codename Red's birthday, and Red is my brother. We've both talked about that on our streams a couple of times already. And this deck is actually the deck that I dedicated to him initially. This is the 3rd deck that I've ever built, and it reminds me a lot of when we would grow up playing StarCraft, because the Slivers feel very much like the Zerg, and if you're not familiar with who the Zerg are in StarCraft, they're these alien creatures that are like reptilian and insectoid kind of put together. They're very versatile, they mutate, and they have a hive mind that they kind of work with, which is exactly what the Slivers are in the lore. They work in a hive mind. So, without further ado, let's actually get into this deck. Alright, so Sliver Overlord is our commander. One for every color in Magic. He's a legendary creature Sliver mutant for a 7/7. He has 3 generic mana to activate. Search your library for a Sliver card, reveal that card, and put it into your hand and shuffle your library. And also we have 3 generic mana, gain control of target Sliver. These are 2 very, very powerful effects. One that you can get for any tutor, or you can tutor for any Sliver in your library, and the second being that you can take control of a Sliver if your opponents control a Sliver, or if your opponents have a Changeling, because Changeling count as every type of creature, and therefore you can take control of Changelings. Or there's even ways to turn your opponent's creatures into Slivers or into Changelings, as we will find out here in a little bit. The card that starts outside the game for us is a very interesting card. It is Giganta the Wellspring. So Giganta the Wellspring is 4 for a hybrid green and red. Elemental Elk, 5/5, and it has Companion. No card in your starting deck has more than one of the same mana symbol in its cost. This is why we are able to have this card as our 101st card, is because of the fact that we can have we have built our deck specifically to where it only has one mana type excuse me, in its actual cost for the colors that it has in it, which in some cases is really good, in other cases not so much. But the other ability for Giganta is you can tap it to add all 5 colors of mana. This mana can't be spent to pay generic mana costs. So while this is a great way to kind of get around our possibility of having lands not have all of our colors, we can cast Giganta. Well, first, because the way Companion works now, you pay 3 mana to put it into your hand first, and then you can cast it later for its mana cost. And then after that, it acts as if it's just part of the normal deck. But in any case, it still comes down, it's still a mana dork that taps for all 5 colors of mana. The only restriction is that it can't be dumped into like Sliver Overlord's ability, which is generic mana. But it can cast Sliver Overlord himself. So we do have, and a lot of slivers you'll see actually do have like 2 colors of mana, and so even if I waste 3 of them, I still get 2 of those colors to cast the, essentially a sliver for free, because if I didn't have this card as my 101st card, I would have to have some other way to get that mana. It also provides a way to get some of our other legendary slivers that are 5 colors in this deck, with tapping down 1 creature as opposed to having to tap down 5 permanents on the battlefield. So let's go into our land base first. Our land base is pretty robust. So we have, to start, pretty simple with our basics. We go heavy on the forests and the islands, and that's particularly because for even in 5 colors, green and blue are always the things that give us the most value. Green gives you access to more things that help you ramp. Blue gives you access to things that help you draw cards. We have to have more of those basics in here for that reason. The specific ones I have in here, you can't really see that on the screen there, but I do have the foil basic lands that actually come from the premium deck slivers from that era, and what they'll have is the little mana symbol that actually has the little sliver sign on it. Actually, what I can do is I can actually look up that set, and I can show you what that looks like here. So let's see, set, and then premium. Oh, I guess that just searches for the cards up there. Hold on. I'm just gonna have to scroll all the way down, probably. Let me see. Okay, so we got the signature spell book, so we're probably getting close here. Multiplayer, judge promos, dual decks, premium decks. Here we go, and slivers. Boom. So yeah, those are what they actually look like, and all of these basics are forests. All of these basics are foils. So that's what the forests look like. That's what the islands look like. We have 2 of each of these. We only have 1 forest, 1 mountain, 1 plains, and 1 swamp. And again, that's because those colors are, we care about them, they matter, but we don't care about them as much as getting the island and the forest that we need, so that we can ramp and get our card draw, because a lot of our cheap cards are going to be our ramp and our card draw. The next thing is our dual lands, right? So our dual lands, we have all of the shock lands except for the 2 original dual lands, like I said, that I actually own. So we have Blood Crypt, Swamp Mountain. It enters, you pay 2 life, it enters untapped. Paying the life so that way it enters untapped is always worth it. Same thing for Breeding Pool, it's just a forest island. Same thing for Hollowed Fountain, it's a plains island. Same thing for Overgrown Tomb. It's a swamp forest. Steam Vents, Island Mountain, Temple Garden, Forest Plains, Watery Grave, Island Swamp. Now, Plateau. This is an original dual land. This taps for either of the colors, as its text suggests, right? It taps it for a red or a white, and that's it. There's no mana cost. There's no downside whatsoever. These cards have not been reprinted since, I want to say, I think it's unlimited, or it does say restricted. So there's 4 sets that these came out, and as you can see there, this thing is a $350 card on TCG Player Mid. These lands in general are really expensive, and Plateau. The crazy thing is that this Plateau and my other one that I have in here, Scrubland, which is the Plains Swamp. These are the least expensive out of the rest of them. They're like, for example, the green blue one, it goes for thousands of dollars. It's ridiculous how much they actually cost. But like I said, I'm not made of bags of gold, but I am trying to save up to one day be able to purchase them and outfit this deck with these lands, and that will be quite the crowning achievement for me as far as getting these particular lands. But it may be a few years, maybe even decades, that before we get to that point. The next set of lands that we have is our lands that tap for every color in this deck, and they have, let's see, Sliver Hive, pretty good. Taps for a colorless, taps for 1 mana of any color if it's spent on a sliver, and then we can pay 5, tap it, and then we get a colorless sliver creature token. More than likely, we're not going to use this part, but I guess if we have extra mana laying around, we could use it. The next one is an amazing land, Cavern of Souls. Cavern of Souls is an $84 card. As this enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Obviously, we're going to choose slivers. It can tap for colorless, or it can tap for mana of any color. You spend it for a creature spell of the chosen type, and that spell can't be countered. This is extremely difficult to combat unless your opponent is playing some sort of land destruction, which is why Cavern of Souls is so good. And then we, of course, have our command tower. Now, the command tower that I do have is a foil version, but foil versions of Command Tower aren't too hard to get a hold of these days, with Commander Legends being out pretty recently. Now, let's go into the stats before we get into the rest of this deck here. So we just went over the lands. The lands, we have 30 of them, which, right by my count, means that we're going to have 16 ramp spells. The creatures, we got our 34, which is decent, because this is a creature-based deck. Artifacts, we have 9, Instants 13, Sorcery 6, and others 9. Others meaning enchantments and planeswalkers. Now, we have 13 instants in this deck because we need to be able to react to things. In an optimized deck, you don't want to waste any time. If somebody's going to stop you from doing something, you need to be able to stop them from trying to stop you, if that makes sense. Our converted mana cost average is 2.7, which is the range that we really like. We only have one card that's over 7 mana, and to be perfectly honest, we never actually cast that card outright. We will always find a way to pitch that into our graveyard and activate that ability, or I guess trigger that ability rather, when it goes to the graveyard. We have 5 spells that are 5, or we have 10 spells, excuse me, that are 5 mana cost, but that's usually because they're the big hefty slivers that we have, or they're cards that help us draw a massive amount of cards. The 4 mana cost range is utility slivers typically, and then 3 and 2 are really the bulk of our deck, and 1 we have a lot of 1 mana costed stuff that helps us churn through our deck. Our ramp, a good portion of our ramp is actually 1. We want this deck to be very, very efficient. It's not CEDH level, but but it's pretty close. So this is why I call it that optimized range, and that's not um, an unknown term, right? This is something that's that they have the power scale that's out there on the internet. If you decide to go look at it, it's out there. You'll find it, and yeah, optimize is considered to be like the 7 to 8 range, which is what I would consider this deck to be. Even it being 5 colors, it doesn't actually hinder it. It actually makes it a lot more powerful that way. Going into the next part, like I said, we talked about the ramp. So our ramp is very, very specific. We want it to be very, very efficient. So for our Soul Ring, we have this Masterpiece Soul Ring. Yes, this is legitimate. This was very difficult for me to get. I bought it. Well, I should say this. I put it on PayPal credit for a birthday gift like 3 years ago, and I paid it off within like 4 months. So yeah, yeah, good use for credit card, being able to pay it off. But mind you, be careful with credit cards. Just saying. In any case, this Soul Ring is awesome. I love it. It's way too expensive though, to be perfectly honest. All right, so next for our ramp is Utopia Sprawl. We want this to enchant a forest specifically, but that's not really hard for us to actually obtain. We choose a color. When it enters the battlefield, the enchanted forest can tap for whatever color it produces, plus a mana of the chosen color that we're choosing to have Utopia Sprawl produce. Then the next one is Wild Growth, which just says that it taps for an additional green, but it's effectively the same thing as Utopia Sprawl. We just don't get to choose the mana. It just taps for a green, which is perfectly fine in this deck. The next one is Birds of Paradise. Birds of Paradise is pretty well known. It's not terribly expensive at $11, but I mean it's still kind of hard to get a hold of. 1 green for a 0/1 bird, has flying, and it can tap for 1 mana of any color. Going into our 2s, we have Arcane Cygnet. This particular version of Arcane Cygnet I think is awesome. And I actually do physically own this version. So it can add 1 mana of any color of our commander's identity. Our commander has all 5, therefore it can add any color that we need. Then we have the Talismans. Now, we don't run every single Talisman in this deck because we need to save some of our other slots for some overlap. So what I did purposefully was get all the Talismans that can tap for green and another color. So we have Talisman of Curiosity that can tap for green and blue, but it deals damage. Again, we've talked about that before. Use your life as a resource in Commander, especially in an optimized deck where the games are going to go a lot faster for you anyway. You might as well take the hits and hopefully be able to pull out the win as quickly as possible. The next one is Talisman of Impulse, green and a red. Talisman of Resilience for green and black. And Talisman of Unity for green and white. And another thing you'll notice too is that it also taps for colorless mana. That's perfect because once we have the colors that we need already on board, then we don't have to take the damage anymore for tapping it for colorless. The next ramp spells that we have for 2 are our actual slivers that tap for mana. So we have Gemhide Sliver. All slivers have tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, which is great. For 1 and a green, a 1/1, it turns all of our slivers, to include this guy, into mana dorks. Now, be mindful with this one, because if your opponents have changelings or your opponents are playing a sliver deck against you, this also means that they will be able to have those abilities. So do be mindful. These older slivers do say all slivers, which actually does make for interesting interaction, because the slivers as a whole are a hive mind. So if you have if different opponents have a sliver deck as well, then you'll all be getting kind of the same abilities, which can also make the game harder in some respects. Now, going into this next one, there was a run of slivers that came out in 2013, 14, and I believe 15, where they reprinted these versions, and these slivers were specific to slivers you control. Now, from my understanding in the lore, I guess the slivers had kind of splintered off. I don't know the entirety of the lore, so I'm not going to pretend like I do. But in any case, these were supposed to emulate that kind of happening in the supposed lore and in the timeline. In any case, it gives you another Mana Dork Sliver that has a different name than Gemhide. So now we have Mana Weft, which is effectively the same thing, except it's just for slivers you control. Now the next one we have is not a sliver, but it's very necessary. Bloom Tender. 1 and a green for a 1/1 elf druid. It taps. For each color among permanents you control, you add 1 mana of that color to your mana pool. To start, it's a 1/1 that taps for a green, which honestly isn't bad. As the game continues to go forward, and we're able to cast more spells and play more things, it will eventually be able to cast for more colors, and especially if we have our commander on board, it will then be able to tap for all of our colors. And this is particularly important, that it is able to cast all of our colors, and I will explain why later. Incubation Druid, for the same reason, is just as important. Now, 1 and a green for a 0/2, it has tap, add 1 mana of any type that a land you control could produce. If Incubation Druid has a +1/+1 counter on it at 3 mana of that type instead. This is also extremely important. Now the cool thing about Incubation Druid is that it does give you a way to put those counters on it by spending 5 mana. Effectively, you get Adapt 3, so you get 3 +1/+1 counters on Incubation Druid. So it'll make him a 3/5, make her, I guess, a 3/5. The thing about it is that we have ways to untap both Incubation Druid and Bloom Tender, and so what we really want to do is be able to use them to create a bunch of mana, if not infinite mana, as it were. We will get to exactly how, though, later. The next cards for our ramp are our actual 3 mana spells, and they're all artifacts. We don't use any land ramp in here because of the fact that we have our lands that search. Oh man, did I even talk about that? I'm gonna have to go back and talk about that. Wow, I'm so out of order tonight. I'll get to that. Anyways, Chromatic Lantern. Chromatic Lantern, this particular version, is another one that I own. And it's amazing. I love the masterpiece artwork. Lands you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, and then it itself adds 1 mana of any color. We've talked about this card before. It fixes all of your colors. It makes it super easy for you to tap for your lands for what you need. Darksteel Ingot and Skyclave Relic. These are important because Darksteel Ingot is 1 indestructible, adds 1 mana of any color. It doesn't seem that great because it only adds 1, but the fact that it's indestructible really matters. Skyclave Relic is basically the same thing, except it has a kicker cost. Now, before I've talked a bunch of crap about kicker and how I hate it. This is probably one of the, I want to say the only card, there might be a couple more out there, but so far this is the only card that I would ever consider paying the kicker cost. Because, 1, it's indestructible anyway. When it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, you create 2 tap tokens that are copies of Skyclave Relic. So, for 6 mana, you get 3 Skyclave Relics. That's pretty decent to me. Now, more often than not, I don't necessarily need them, so I will just pay the 3 to get the 1 Skyclave Relic, but this still gives me an option if I really need the mana, or if I just have the extra mana that I can sink into it. Again, it is also indestructible, which is another reason why we have that. It gives us a little bit of that redundancy, so that way we can utilize these effects later. Now, going back to the lands, I did go over the dual lands, and I think I got too excited about the original dual lands that I totally forgot to mention the fetch lands, the real fetch lands. So, Arid Mesa. Pay 1 life, sacrifice Arid Mesa, search library for a mountain or plains card, put it into the battlefield, then shuffle your library. These cards are so efficient at what they do, and again, you're having to use your life as a resource. You might as well to get the game to end as quickly as possible. Arid Mesa, Bloodstained Mire does the same thing for Swamp and a Mountain. Flooded Strand does the same thing for Plains and Island. Marsh Flats for Swamp and Plains. Misty Rainforest for Forest and Island. Polluted Delta for Island and Swamp. Scalding Tarn for Island and Mountain. Verdant Catacombs for Swamp and Forest. Windswept Heath for Forest and Plains, and Wooded Foothills for Forest and Mountain. Mind you, these cards are all very expensive, especially for this land base. Do not be discouraged. It's possible, but it has taken me a very long time to collect these cards. So, again, if you're trying to build a deck like this for yourself, it's completely possible. It will just take some time. Unless you're already made of bags of gold, then in that case it's super easy for you, and I wish the best for you, I suppose. Maybe you could donate me some money. I'm kidding. I don't care. Alright, so let's go to our card draw. Super important that we have very efficient card draw. Now, this is too, like I said, this is a little bit unconventional. Hey, happy birthday. That's fine, you don't have to donate anything. I know you're not made of bags of gold. But you are in the Air Force, so you are like, you know, like, you guys are the favorite child, for sure. Happy birthday, by the way. I don't know if you got to see my little introduction in the beginning, but this deck is the deck that I, when I was actually building this, originally, I was filling sandbags all day. That sounds like so much fun. I would definitely not like to do that at all. I'm also at a point where I don't really do things like that. So I could if I had to, but more than likely somebody else is going to do it. But again, if I don't know if you were paying attention to, like, if you were here for the beginning of it, or if you could go back and see it later. Whatever. I'll say it again. It's fine. So once again, happy birthday. This deck is actually the original deck that I have dedicated to you, because this deck, being the slivers, function very much like the Zerg, and I know you already know what the Zerg is, so I don't have to explain that to you. But this deck is optimized. It's very fast. It's very efficient at what it does, and it is a combo deck that can kind of pivot and do what it needs to do to either combo out or be extremely aggressive, or it can protect itself. Yes, for the Hive. Yes, and that's exactly what this deck does. It's very the slivers in this deck do have this hive mind mentality where it likes to, they each have an ability, but those abilities that they have affect all of the other slivers on the battlefield. Okay, so going back for the build, where we're getting into the actual card draw spells. So, Opt, super efficient cantrip. We have, yeah, it is pretty dope. Opt, super efficient. It's 1 blue for an instant, which means you can play it at any time. We scry 1, look at the top card of our library, decide if it's going to stay on top or go on the bottom, and then we draw a card. Pretty easy to understand. Preordain, pretty much the same thing, except it's a sorcery, so we can only cast it on our turn, but we get to scry 2, and then we get to draw a card. Next one is Worldly Council, which I think is a lot of fun. Worldly Council has Domain, so for 2 mana, so 1 in a blue, we get, look at the top X cards of our library, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control. Because we have all of the Gucci lands in here, we have all of the basic land types pretty efficiently in this deck. So more than likely we're going to be able to dig for 5, so that X is going to be 5, and then we put 1 of the cards into our hand, the rest go on the bottom of our library. Being able to dig in this deck is going to be very, very, very important, so that way we can get to the cards we need as quickly as possible. The next one is Impulse. Impulse is not uncommon. We've seen it before. So 1 in a blue. Look at the top 4 cards. This one is just static 4, whereas Worldly Council more than likely will be 5, but it isn't always 5. But this is a static 4. We look at the top 4, put 1 of those into our hand, the rest go on the bottom. And that's really it for our cantrips. Now, I don't typically run 4 cantrips in my deck. Usually I like to run about 5 or 6, but in this particular deck we actually need a little bit more cards that either refill our hand or can trigger on each other going through the game. So the next one we have for our mass card draw spells, here, let me find it. We're going to start with Distant Melody. Alright, so 3 and a blue for a sorcery, choose a creature type. We're obviously going to choose Slivers, and we're going to draw a card for each permanent you control of that type. So we're going to draw a card for every Sliver that we control. For 4 mana, that's really decent. We can draw a whole bunch of cards off of that. The next one is going to be Return of the Wild Speaker. Return of the Wild Speaker is 4 and a green for choose one. The non-human creatures you control get +3/+3 until the turn is great, but more than likely we're not going to use that. We're using it for this part here. Draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control. Well, our commander is a Sliver mutant that's definitely not a human, which means that we are going to be drawing... Yeah, because it's the greatest power, so more than likely that's going to be our commander, which is a 7/7. So we're going to refill our hand for 7 cards for 5 mana. That's really good. I mean, it's really good to get cards that's for 4 mana that draw you 3 cards, so getting 7 cards for 5 mana is really good. The next one is Stinging Study, and Stinging Study is 4 and a black for you draw X cards and you lose X life, where X is the mana value of a commander you own on the battlefield or in the command zone. This is fantastic because this doesn't care where our commander is. We just get cards. Now, drawing 5 and losing 5 life sounds like it hurts, but honestly, it's worth it. Like we said, in a deck that wants to be super fast and super efficient at what it does, use life as a resource. Just make sure you don't completely run dry of your life account. Alright, so the next one that we're going to get into is the removal. So again, this deck we do have a couple of things that go on theme, but for the most part, we are very, very efficient at removing stuff. Path to Exile. 1 white mana, exile a target creature, its controller can search for a basic land card, put it into the battlefield. Swords to Plowshares, exile target creature for 1 white mana, its controller gains life equal to its power. We don't care about them gaining life, we can probably smack them with our commander and they'll lose that life anyway. The next one is kind of a weird one, but I do count it as removal. And it is Amoeboid Changeling. Amoeboid Changeling is one that is itself is a changeling, so as you can see that it's every creature type at all times. Now this is the part that combines with our commander. Target creature gains all creature types until end of turn. The other part says target creature loses all creature types until end of turn. Though I'm sure it has its uses, I have never used it that way. The top one is the one that I've used it for because let's go back to our commander. Our commander says for the bottom ability we can pay 3 to take control of a target sliver. So if we have our Amoeboid Changeling turn an opponent's creature into a changeling, and therefore means it's also a sliver in addition to its other types, we can pay 3 mana to take control of that creature. And that makes people pretty salty. It's seen it plenty of times. That changeling looks awful. I'm sure it feels awful. Alright, next one we've got is Nature's Claim. Destroy target artifact or enchantment for 1 green mana. It's a super cheap card. It says it's $1. I've found it for cheaper. Its controller gains 4 life. Next one is Wear and Tear. I really like this card because it's versatile. You can pay 1 mana on this side to destroy target enchantment, or you can pay 1 and a red to destroy target artifact, or it does have this fuse part where you can pay the whole mana cost of 1 red and white, and you can destroy both an artifact and an enchantment, which is pretty decent. Now, the next card is one of our awesome slivers, Harmonic Sliver. 1, a green, and a white. All slivers have, when this creature comes into play, destroy target artifact or enchantment. Now, this includes Harmonic Sliver when it is played. Okay? The other part that's super important is that this is not a may trigger. Cards that say may means you can choose to not do it, right? But if this card doesn't have that may on the card, like this one, that means you have to do it. So if your opponents do not have an artifact or an enchantment to target, that means you have to blow up your own stuff if you have some. Which is why Darksteel Ingot and Skyclave Relic are super important to have in this deck, and the fact that they're indestructible. Because you can target these things, and the ability of destroying just fizzles, because even though it is a legal target, indestructible just says, oh, I can't be destroyed. So that is why we have to keep those particular artifacts in this deck. Now, for our mass removal, we've got some kind of weird ones, but I think they're a lot of fun. So 1, Fell the Mighty is fantastic. 4 and a white for destroy all creatures with power greater than target creature's power. Now, slivers by themselves are typically really small. So I can have a 2/2 sliver, and my opponents might have some big beefy things with trample, and I'm going to destroy all of their big stuff, and all of my small stuff survives. Now, this could include my commander, but we have access to our commander all the time. It's not really hard to recast it. Also, because of the fact that our commander is a Sliver Tutor on a stick, we can probably find our protection slivers faster than they are going to have protection for their board state, to which case all of our board wipes then become one-sided board wipes. So it doesn't matter. Thousands of Zerglings, yeah. Oh, believe me, we're getting there. All you need, yes, believe me, we're getting there. We're getting there. Alright, so the next one that I count as a board wipe is Thorncaster Sliver. Thorncaster Sliver is slivers you control have whenever this creature attacks, it deals 1 damage to target creature or player. Now, this is one of those red cards that's been errated to any target. Now, this means that it can target a player, a creature, or a planeswalker. Now, the thing is that it does have to attack in order to do so. And slivers by themselves, if you have a bunch of them and you swing out, you can ping a bunch of like little mana dorks or maybe even some tokens that your opponents have, what have you. The key here is combining this with another sliver that we have in this deck that is used for a more aggressive strategy, Venom Sliver. 1 and a green for a 1/1. Slivers you control have Death Touch. We've talked about Death Touch before. Any amount of damage a creature with Death Touch deals to a creature is enough to destroy it. So, that means that if we combine this with Thorncaster Sliver, our slivers go to attack before blocks even happen in combat. This trigger will happen. It deals 1 damage to a creature of your choice, depending on how many slivers you have attacking, and then Death Touch kicks in and says, okay, it dealt 1 damage to that creature is dead. Does not matter if it's a 5/5, a 16/16, or a 1,000/1,000. If it doesn't have indestructible or hexproof, that thing is dead. The next board wipe is a pretty brutal board wipe. It's Cyclonic Rift. And I've talked about Cyclonic Rift before. Cyclonic Rift is the reason why if we have an ability to run a counterspell of some sort, this is why we run it. Because Cyclonic Rift is the bane of everyone's existence in Commander. Cyclonic Rift is 1 and a blue for return target non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand. Now, that part isn't the bad part. It's the overload part. 6 and a blue, you may cast a spell for its overload cost. I almost said overlord cost. If you do, change its text by replacing all instances of target with each, which means the fact that it's an instant means more than likely I'm going to play this on the turn before my opponent passes the turn to me, and I'm going to return everybody's stuff to their hand, and my board is completely free to do whatever it wants to do. Alright, now that I've gotten through the removal, I'm going to take it back to us for a second. We're going to go over some card draw stuff that's a little bit more important. We went over the cantrips and the mass card draw already, but these care a little bit more about like our permanence on the battlefield, right? So we have an expensive one called Rhystic Study. Rhystic Study is a $37, $38 card right now. Yeah, this particular version, not surprising. So, Rhystic Study is an enchantment for 2 and a blue. Whenever your opponent plays a spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 1. There's an old adage that goes to this, is that people say you never pay the 1 because you want your mana for your stuff, but you always pay the 1. You always pay the 1. People are into people are into too much shenanigans if they're casting spells and then you're casting spells and they're just drawing cards off of you playing stuff. It's always bad. Always pay the 1 if you can. The next one is actually a sliver that we have, and it is Hollowhead Sliver. Hollowhead Sliver is a 2 and a red for a 2/2. Sliver creatures you control have tap, discard a card to draw a card. Now, this does help us churn through our deck. Typically, we don't really want stuff going to our graveyard in this deck, but we do have ways to recur and shuffle things back into our library. It's not a big deal if we discard to that way we can churn through our deck. Plus, there might be something in our hand that we just simply don't need. The next sliver that helps us draw cards is Dormant Sliver. 2 and a green and a blue for a 2/2. All slivers have Defender, and when this creature comes into play, draw a card. Now, Dormant Sliver it has that drawback of Defender, which means that it can't attack. However, we do have ways to either sacrifice Dormant Sliver or bounce Dormant Sliver back to our hand. When it's time for us to attack, we will be able to get Dormant Sliver out of the way, so that way we can finish off the opponent. The next card that we have is actually one of our Planeswalkers. And we have 2 Planeswalkers in this deck, and they're both here for the same reason. So we have one, a blue and a red, for Will and Rowan, a legendary Planeswalker. I guess it should be walkers, because there are 2 of them, but that's fine. So Will and Rowan, we have +1, draw a card, then discard a card. This is the reason why this card is in this deck. But there are some other things that we can do with it too. So +1, target creature gains +2/+0 and gains first strike and trample until end of turn. This part is great for any of our slivers just to give some extra abilities if we so choose. And then -8, if we get there, draw 4 cards. When you do, the Royal Scions deals damage to any target equal to the number of cards in your hand. So it gives us potentially mass card draw, and we can potentially destroy something. It's not terrible. More than likely, we're not going to get to this ultimate. This is why when I slotted this card in here, I wanted to base it off of this +1 ability right here. The next one is Nahiri the Harbinger, a 2 and a red and a white for a similar thing. +2, you may discard a card. If you do, you draw a card. We have this card in here for this reason, not for the other stuff, but the other stuff is nice. We have a -2, exile target enchantment, tapped artifact, or tapped creature. Sometimes if the creature that we're dealing with is menacing and it doesn't have vigilance, yeah, let's get rid of it. And then -8, search your library for an artifact or creature card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. It gains haste. Return it to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. Kind of cool. It gives us a tutor, more than likely for a creature rather than an artifact that we need, because we do have specific creatures that we are trying to get to into this deck. Again, this is just icing on the cake. We are really here just wanting the card draw and this discard outlet, because we do have a card in here that does care about being discarded. And again, if we just want to pitch something that we don't need, we have the ability to do that to hopefully draw into something that we do need. The next one I think is a super fun card for this deck. Bounty of Luxa. And I think a lot of people sleep on this card because they're like, this card is a 37 cents? Yeah. I think this card is slept on a lot. This card is good for another strategy for like morph, right? And because it gives you because it gives you 3 free mana. We'll talk about that here in just a second. So at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, remove all flood counters from Bounty of Luxa. If no counters were removed this way, put a flood counter on Bounty of Luxa and draw a card. Otherwise, add blue, green, and colorless. Now, with blue, green, and colorless, that gives us 3 mana. We can do some specific things with it, and I did tell you about how blue and green are super important to have in this deck for our card draw and our ramp. Now, the cool thing about this, though, is that in combination with our commander, right? It's not like a super combo, but it's a nice synergy. Or I'll say that. It's a nice synergy. So with our commander that has 3 generic mana, so that way we can tutor for a sliver in our library, this essentially translates to, at the beginning of each combat main phase, you either get to draw a card, or you get to draw a sliver, which is super cool. I have actually used this a couple of times, and I do not regret it one bit. I love this card, and I think this card is going to have a permanent home here. The last of our card draw permanents that we have is a human, actually. And I don't have very many humans in this deck, but the ones that are here do some pretty decent stuff. So we've got 2, a green and a white for a 0/4 human noble. And it has a Coven, which is a pretty new ability that comes out of the latest Innistrad set. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 creature you control. Then if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, draw a card. Now, the key here is that it says you can put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature you control. So you don't have to. And you still get to draw a card if you have creatures with 3 different powers. More than likely, you will. If you're able to play Lenore, you have your commander, and you have literally any other sliver, you're going to have a 0, a 7/7, and probably a 1/1 or a 2/2 to start out with. So there you go. You already have your ability to start drawing cards. Now, another part of this theme here that I really like, that I was able to do, is that much like the Zerg, the slivers want to completely take over planes, right? So I've added these humans in here, kind of like how the Zerg take over humans, and I do actually want to petition either my wife or somebody to do some artwork for me, so I can change some of my humans in the artwork here to have like glowing eyes and have like slivers kind of like slithering around them, as it were. And I just think that would be super cool to kind of keep them all kind of the same and have that kind of like almost like StarCraft kind of theme going about them. But that's neither here nor there. I will get to that when I can get to that. Okay, so let's go into our protection stuffs. Now, our protection stuffs, we're going to start out with our counter spells. And our counter spells are super important because they can be very, very efficient. First is Fierce Guardianship. Fierce Guardianship has gone up in price. The commander deck that Fierce Guardianship comes with, we used to call it the Fierce Guardianship Value Pack, because the commander deck itself had already costs $40 for all 100 cards that are in it for the pre-constructed deck. And then the card by itself was rated at 40 cards after it initially came out. So, yeah. I'm hitting you the old lurk, bud. I'm falling asleep. Okay, bud. Alright. Yeah, man. Have a good night. Appreciate the view. Appreciate the lurk. Always appreciate my lurkers. In any case, so Fierce Guardianship is 2 and a blue. If you control a commander, you may cast this spell without paying its mana cost, and you counter target non-creature spell. This is specifically in here to counter a counter spell or to counter somebody else having something similar to Cyclonic Rift. We want to keep our board state as full as possible so we can smash into our opponents. We don't want our opponents being able to interrupt in any way of what we are trying to do. The next one is a super cool one, Evasive Action. So 1 in a blue, you counter a target spell unless its controller pays 1 for each basic land type among lands you control. This is a 25-cent card. I highly recommend getting him for your 5-color decks or even your 4-color decks. And this card, because we're in 5 colors, more than likely we're going to have all 5 of the basic land types among lands that we control. So they're going to have to pay 5, which is pretty steep cost. If they're able to pay the 5, then they deserve to win, and I guess they deserve to have that spell. But more than likely, that effectively counters that spell. The next one is one of my favorites. It is Crystalline Sliver. So Crystalline Sliver is a white and a blue for a 2/2 sliver. All slivers have Shroud. Shroud is different from Hexproof. Because Hexproof we've kind of talked about before, it means that it can't be targeted by stuff your opponents control. Shroud means they can't be targeted by anything, to include your own stuff. So you do have to be very careful. And that is another reason why it's important for what Lenore's text is, where it says up to 1 target creature you control. You don't have to target a creature. More than likely we're going to target Lenore with her own ability. But if our slivers have Shroud on them, we don't have to worry about not drawing cards or buffing up our creatures at least a little bit. We can just find another non-sliver creature that we have that can put the counter on it. Hibernation Sliver is another great one. So a blue and a black for a 2/2 sliver. All slivers have pay 2 life. Return this permanent to its owner's hand. This guy is like my panic button. If there is no other way that I can stop what's happening, at the very least I can pay a bunch of life and put all those cards back into my hand so that way I can replay my board the very next turn. I would much rather that than them go into the graveyard, because this deck is, like I said, it's not a reanimation deck. It has stuff to help me get stuff out of the graveyard, but more than likely it is not very good at doing that. And I was going to say, more than likely we're not going to be able to do it because it's not very good at doing it. There we go. That's what I meant to say. Alright, the next one is a pretty cool one. Root Sliver. 3 and a green for a 2/2 sliver. Straight up, Root Sliver can't be countered, and Sliver spells can't be countered. Another way that protects our creatures, so that way we do have a very heavy creature strategy. We want to protect our creatures as best we can, and as much as possible. And the next card is just pretty much the same. Rhythm of the Wild. 1 a green and a 1 a red and a green. I was gonna flip flop them. Enchantment. Creature spells you control can't be countered. Again, protecting our creatures because of our creature strategy. Then we have non-token creatures you control have red, which means they enter with haste or a +1/+1 counter. Now, a lot of times we want our creatures to have haste for a variety of reasons, but we also, in particular, want this to go with Incubation Druid. We don't want to give Incubation Druid haste, we want to give it a +1/+1 counter. Also, Lenore, being another creature that we can put a +1/+1 counter onto Incubation Druid. We have some ways to get counters onto Incubation Druid without having to pay the 5. So it's nice to have those options. That way we don't have to worry about that. The next one for the last one for our protection is one that should seem pretty obvious if you're an experienced player, and it's going to be Sliver Overlord. I really have a good time with Sliver Overlord, however my opponents do not. Because usually when Sliver Overlord comes out, the Crystalline Sliver is not far behind, or if Crystalline Sliver comes out, the Sliver Overlord is not far behind. So if I'm able to get the 2 out, it's pretty hard to stop me. Not to say that it's impossible, but it is pretty hard. Alright, so now that we've gone over our protection pieces, let's go into our Recursion Package. And like I said, our Recursion Package is not very robust in this deck, but we do have ways to recycle our cards put them back into our deck or put them back into our hand at the very least, so that way we can replay them. Because we do have access to a lot of mana, so it is easier for us to put things back into our hand rather than pay a bunch of mana to have it come straight back onto the battlefield. The first way, though, is Kozilek, Butcher of Truth. Kozilek is, like I mentioned before, we are never going to outright cast this card for the 10 mana. In fact, we probably won't cast this spell at all. When it enters the battlefield, you can draw 4 cards. It has Annihilator. Whenever this creature attacks, defending player sacrifices 4 permanents. And when Kozilek is put into a graveyard from anywhere, its owner shuffles his or her graveyard into his or her library. This is really the part that we care about, because we now have our own ways to discard Kozilek so we can put our graveyard back into our library, because we want to have our commander to have access to every single sliver that we have in our deck. We don't want to have any gap, or at least we want to minimize the gap for us to be able to pull things back out of our graveyard. If there's a way that we can put it back into our deck, then that's what we want to do. I'd much rather pay 3 to retutor for that after shuffling it back in than have to pay 5 mana to recast the sliver. But we do have other ways to cast our stuffs should we need to. One of those is Reanimate. 1 black for a sorcery. Put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. You lose life equal to its converted mana cost. Again, we have this card in here because it's super efficient. Not for any other reason other than that. It's super efficient and it's an emergency. I need this creature back on the battlefield right now. The next one that we have is Thyroxine Reclamation. This one is actually super cool, and it actually has saved me a few times. So this 1 black for a black and a colorless, pay 2 life, return target creature from the graveyard to your hand. A lot of our slivers are pretty cheap anyway, so paying an extra 2 mana and 2 life to get it back into our hand, so that way we can recast it, it's not terrible. I'll take it. The next one we have is Regrowth. Regrowth is one that we've seen before. 1 in a green, return target creature from your graveyard to your hand. Pretty self-explanatory. And then the next one we have is another one of our humans that can do a lot of stuff. Kenrith, the Returned King. He's a very versatile card, and this is exactly why he's in the deck, because he's so versatile. So we have, I put him in our recursion/reanimation though, because as far as my card slots are concerned, this is the only one he really fits as a main purpose, but he can do all this other stuff too. So he's a 5/5 human noble, 1 red, all creatures gain trample and haste until end of turn. 1 in a green, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Cool, probably Incubation Druid, just saying. 2 in a white for target player gains 5 life. 3 in a blue for target creature draws a card, and 4 in a black for put target creature from a graveyard onto the battlefield under its owner's control. So, like I said, we put the Kenrith in here for the main purpose of it being we have a way to access our graveyard now, but we actually have ways to do other stuff too, which can be just as important depending on how fast our game is going. Okay, so the next thing too that we got some value stuffs here. Let's go back down to our enchantments. Training Grounds. Training Grounds is a $32 card. This card has retained its value. It's actually gone up a little bit, but even back when I got it, it was a $25 card. So 1 blue for an enchantment that reads, activated abilities of creatures you control cost up to 2 less to activate. This effect can't reduce the amount of mana and ability cost to activate this less than 1 mana. So basically we can't use abilities for free. But we can still pay 1, and I would much rather pay 1 to tutor for a sliver or take control of target sliver with our commander than 3, if I can help it. 3's not bad, 1's pretty decent. The next one we got is Vampiric Tutor. 1 black for an instant, pay 2 life, search your library for any card, shuffle your library, then put that card on top. We're probably going to cast this at the end of our opponent's turn, so that way we can actually draw into the card that we really want. And the other one is Demonic Tutor. Demonic Tutor is 1 and a black for search your library, take 1 card, put it into your hand, reshuffle your library. These are not inexpensive cards. And like I said, this deck is a deck that I have been working on for a very, very long time. It took me a long time to collect some of these cards, and some of these cards have even gone further up in price than when I had initially bought them. So I was lucky when I got them, and I know that there are some other people got them when these cards first came out in their packs, and I'm kind of jealous of those guys because they got it for way cheaper than I did. So, some other slivers that we should mention, or I should say some other cards that we should mention, because they are definitely worth mentioning. Gale Rider Sliver, 1 blue mana to give all slivers that we control flying. Amazing card. Striking Sliver, 1 red mana to give all of our slivers first strike, which can be super important in combat. We talked about Venom Sliver already, and why he's incredibly useful, but another reason why he's useful is because he can go with Striking Sliver. It's going to make our opponents it's going to give our opponents a way to think twice about blocking our slivers, because First Strike and Death Touch could just ram through anything. Just about. The next one is Heart Sliver. Heart Sliver gives all sliver creatures haste, so we have a couple of them that give haste in here, and we really haste is kind of important, so that way we can, if say that we have a Heart Sliver and we have Gemhide Sliver, right? We want to be able to use our mana immediately, so we can get more stuff out onto the board. The next one is Sentinel Sliver. So Sentinel Sliver gives all of our slivers we control Vigilance, which is pretty decent. Next one is Cloud Shredder Sliver, which is awesome. So it gives us both flying and haste for slivers that we control. So we have a little bit of redundancy there. Another one is Ghost Flame Sliver. Now, Ghost Flame Sliver I think is an honorable mention, though I want to count him as a protection sliver. He's not really full on protection. But he does do something interesting where all slivers have colorless, or are colorless, which means that like they don't like the colors that they have, like even Ghost Flame Sliver as a black and red, it is actually not a black red, it is just straight colorless. And this is important because there are definitely cards out there in Magic that have protection from certain colors. And if they have protection from any color, they have protection from our commander. So we need to be very cognizant about that. Ghost Flame Sliver gives us that ability to kind of get past that, and we can actually smash through still. And they will be forced to block whatever we throw at them. A card that we really like for our aggressive strategy is Shadow Sliver. So we have 2 in the blue for a 1/1. All slivers have Shadow, which means they can block, and they can only be blocked by creatures with Shadow. Shadow is not a very common card these days, or common keyword, I should say, these days. It does exist, it's out there, but it's not very often that my Sliver deck goes up against other decks that have Shadow in them. Another one is Najeela the Blade Blossom. Najeela the Blade Blossom is amazing. 2 and a red for a 3/2 human warrior. Whenever a warrior attacks, you may have its controller create a 1/1 white warrior creature token that is tapped and attacking. And then it's 1 of every color to untap all attacking creatures. They gain trample, lifelink, and haste until end of turn. After this phase, there is an additional combat phase. Activate this ability only during combat. Now, on top of the fact that Najeela gives us a bunch of keywords for all of our slivers, and even our warrior tokens that we decide to create, should we create them, this gives us a sink that we can put Giganta into after we've cast a whole bunch of stuff, and it utilizes all of that. So, again, we have a way to utilize that mana that isn't paying a generic cost, and it doesn't go to waste even after we use that mana to cast like one of our other slivers or one of our other creatures that has 2 colors. And then the last honorable mention here is Sliver Legion. Sliver Legion is a big beefy boy that makes all of our slivers big beefy boys. So one of every color for a 7/7 sliver. All sliver creatures get +1/+1 for each other sliver on the battlefield. This is typically, when I put down Sliver Legion, this is how I end the game via combat. Now, it doesn't happen every time, but if I have to pivot in order to end the game via combat, this is the one I'm going to search for in order to end it. Now, let's get to the two things that the deck can do via combo, which I think is super cool. Now, the super cool combo is we utilize a sliver called Scuttling Sliver. So 2 and a blue for sliver creatures you control have 2, untap this creature. This becomes extremely important with a card called Mirror Entity. Now Mirror Entity is a changeling and therefore it is also a sliver. We have 2 and a white for a 1/1 changeling. X, until end of turn, creatures you control have a base power XX and power and toughness, XX, and to gain all creature types. Which again means that they're going to be all slivers. Now, remember when I was talking to you about those elves, that we really care about them being able to tap for all colors of mana, like Incubation Druid being able to tap for at a minimum 3 of any color that we have, and Bloom Tender being able to tap for all colors. This is because if we can at least tap that into Mirror Entity to turn all of our creatures into slivers, we can also then use other mana to then untap our elves that tap for mana, because they now count as slivers. So now we create infinite mana with our Sliver Trilobite and our quote-unquote Sliver Elves that we have, and they will tap and untap, creating us infinite mana. That infinite mana can then be dumped into our commander, Sliver Overlord, so we can tutor for every sliver in our library, and we can play out every sliver right then and there. This is the super fun one that I think is super cool, because then I get to play out all my slivers, and I get to smash face, ending it via with Sliver Legion and the Shadow Sliver. Now, the other way, which is the very efficient way to win, is by using another 3 slivers that I have not mentioned yet. One of them is Basil Sliver. So Basil Sliver is 2 and a black for all slivers have sacrifice this creature, add 2 black to your mana pool for a 2/2. We also have Lava Belly Sliver, which is 1, a red, and a white for sliver creatures you control have when this creature enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to target player or planeswalker, and you gain 2 life for a 2/2. Now, the reason why both of these are important is because it goes with Sliver Queen. Yes, I do actually own a copy of Sliver Queen. It was much cheaper when I bought it, and I was super surprised to see that it go up to about $360. I almost had a heart attack, but I'm so glad that, and I even was, actually I was complaining at the time because I had bought it for $68, because I found one for $68, and I was like, man, this is so expensive, and then it shot up to $360, and now I'm like, oh my gosh. I'm super glad that I do own a real copy, though, because she is called Combo Queen for a reason, and this is another one of those combos that she can do very well. So, she is a sliver, right? Pay 2, put a sliver token into play, it counts as a 1/1 colorless creature. So, what does that mean? That means we put a sliver token into play, or we have another sliver that we can just sacrifice as fodder with the ability of our Basil Sliver, adding 2 black mana, which means that we can pay that black mana into our Sliver Queen, which is going to then create a Sliver token. That Sliver token is then going to trigger Lava Belly Sliver, and that is going to deal 1 damage to a target player, and we're going to gain 1 life, and then the train starts over again. We can sacrifice that token to add 2 black mana, and blah 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 blah. The train keeps going. I call that the Machine Gun Sliver. I'm sure somebody else uses a different term or a similar term. In any case, I like to call it Machine Gun Slivers, and that is exactly the easiest route for this deck to go, is to find those 3, put them out there as quickly as possible, and just machine gun the whole table. And I will say that it has happened on more than one occasion, and it's because of the way that this deck is built, how efficient it is, and I'm not going to lie, the cards are very expensive, and it took me a long time to get them. It is very efficient at what it does. It doesn't mean that it's going to win every single time because, right, there's no guarantee that any deck wins every single time. You see, you know, $50 decks beat $6,000 decks. It happens from time to time. But it is, I will say that this is a optimized build. It is very good at what it does. Its win rate or win ratio is much higher than some of my other decks, and that could also just be because this is one of my oldest standing decks too. But in any case, Slivers is one of my favorite tribes in all of Magic, and I was really glad to be able to put together a Sliver deck that felt very similar to me, like the Hive Mind that the Zerg have in StarCraft. And again, this is the deck that I actually dedicate to my brother. Even though I did that Pokemon one, which was kind of for fun for a live deck build, this is the one that I actually play, and I have been constantly adjusting for, since 2017. And technically I'm still trying to get the other cards to completely finish it out and make it the best possible version that it can be without it going to quote-unquote CEDH. In any case, I am Leyline, or Salty Mike, here at Leyline MTG. Thank you guys for listening to my Decksplaination of my deck, and I do really enjoy playing this deck. I don't know if I'm going to be playing this deck tomorrow for my spell table with my play group, but you're perfectly welcome to join and watch. I'm pretty sure I'm going to use a deck that's a little bit less powerful, but still more fun. That being said, I really appreciate you guys listening. Please consider following me also on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. I do post there at least once a day to try to get some discussions out there. And it's also where I put out my schedule on what's going to be happening for when I go live on Twitch. I love you guys. Thank you guys for the support. Lurkers are not lurking. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see y'all later. Swing by for the spell table tomorrow, guys. Same time, 9 p.m. See you later.